Last night, I was just clearing out some old history magazines, and there was a moment which, in many ways, is very relevant to what we're talking about today, because I happened to be reading an article by Richard Evans, the professor of history who specializes in German history, and it was about Auschwitz. But the music on while I was doing the job, and the music happened to be playing as I was reading this about Auschwitz was Strauss, Blue Danube. And there came a moment when I sort of stopped reading and thought, this is weird. I've got Strauss I'm listening to and I'm reading about Auschwitz. And then I thought, actually, that is not an anachronism at all. Because for one thing, that is exactly the sort of music that the Germans played, or that the Nazis, the SS played as people went into the gas chambers, partly to calm them, but also the sense in which those two very, very different stories come from the same roots. Obviously, Hitler grew up in Vienna. He's a product of Vienna. Strauss obviously embodies Vienna. But there's a root sense, not beyond just the individual, that the two are products of the same sort of culture, the same sort of cultural reckoning and background. That's not a comment particularly about the Germans of Vienna. It is a recognition that civilization is a complex idea. It's fragile. It's full of contradictions. And I think what sort of gets me about this particular motion for debate is that it conjures up the idea of civilization as a sort of city, as one entity, which is surrounded by enemies in the way it's under siege. And that suggests not only that the enemies out there, and I have no doubt that there are plenty of people, as there always have been, who dislike Western civilization and would love to destroy it and love to bring it down. That's always been the case. But rather, and in the sense this does echo what Tiffany's just been saying, rather, it's a question of internally understanding we mean by civilization, particularly the civilization in which we live and were brought up. The idea of civilization was central to my own specialism, which is the British Empire. And I think people often forget this, that the British Empire believed very firmly that it represented civilization. And the point about civilization as a term is that it carries its contradiction within it. Because civilization, going right the way back to the Greeks, talking about those who didn't speak Greek as those who spoke which gives us the word barbarian. You can't really have the concept of civilization without an other with a capital O, a barbarian other. And therefore, it's not a sort of morally neutral term. It's not in the sense that you can talk about different cultures, but civilization is a sort of assumption of a certain sort of moral leadership, moral superiority. And indeed, Kenneth Clark, in his series Civilization, did indeed talk about it as fragile and as under threat right from the very beginning of the very first program. But threat from what and threat from where? Obviously, the idea of civilization under threat is not new. You can look at people talking about threats to the Western civilization going back to the 1930s and indeed the 1900s. But it seems to me that these ideas of a threat do rather assume this idea that civilization is somehow easily defined, and it's unified, and that we know what it is. And I'm by no means certain that is actually the case. It's not so much just a question of confidence, although there is certainly an element of that, but rather principles we think of as underlying Western concepts of civilized behavior, civilized organization, are much weaker and more questionable, not just in terms of recent developments. Cancel culture is an obvious one, which has come up many times in debates here. But actually, I would say we say we believe in democracy, for example. Do we really? I'm by no means convinced that we do. I think I look at certain developments like the American presidential election, leaving aside the candidates for a moment. Are you seriously going to tell me that is a model of democracy, that in the country, the power inside the United States, you come down to a choice between two individuals only? Would you actually design a democratic system along those lines? I perceive a better choice in a formal election in a school, or the referendum, which seems to be a sort of a profoundly democratic thing. Action, of course, is always the tool of dictators. The House of Lords, not about the House of Lords reform of the hereditary peers. That's a complete red herring. But the idea that you can the idea that you can nominate your political supporters to a lifetime position in one of the houses of your legislature, I think is a profoundly undemocratic idea. You can extend this into: do we really believe in the rule of law when it's a question of sex crimes? I'm by no means sure that we do. So is civilization under siege? I think it's much more a question. Yes, of course it is. Yes, I don't think there's any real sort of dispute about that. But I think the real area to define is, are we absolutely certain, A, that we know what civilization is, and B, that we are as civilized as we think we are? And I think that as long as we are uncertain of that, and as long as we're not addressing that, in a sense, it doesn't matter what the threats from outside are. They're not so much threats from other people inside, they're threats from within ourselves.
Thanks.